Hello, welcome to my Research Ed Knowledge talk. I'm Brett Kingsbury. You can find me at on Twitter at Brett_Kingsbury or on my blog at a commonbiologist.wordpress.com. I'm going to be talking today about a model for sequencing in biology. Whilst yes, it's subject specific, I think the kind of concepts and ideas are applicable to other sort of content heavy subjects as well. So just a brief overview then of what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk first about what I think the problem is with a subject like biology and where I was going wrong before. I then want to talk about sort of why I decided to sort of start looking at things a bit differently, and then how I obviously then started to change things and look at this idea of, or a different way of sort of sequencing things. Okay, so here's where I think the problem is with biology and the content within it. So just pause the video right now and just have a read through. So we've got the question at the top here, and then just a kind of model response to that question. So just pause the video and have a read of that. Okay, so this is obviously an exemplar response. This is something I want my students to be able to do by the end of their GCSE, say. So where do I think the problems are, and why do I think not all my students are getting there with that? Okay, well, first of all, there's just a lot, as you can see, a lot of factual content. Okay, so we've got things like names of hormones in there, and these are not common words. Follicle and luteinizing, not common words at all. We've got then what they do, their functions. Okay, and on top of that, we've got the idea that obviously they need to tie those two ideas together so that one is linked to the other in both of those cases. And then on top of that, if you look carefully at those two different sort of definitions, if you like, or functions of those hormones, we can see they're actually really, really similar. One talks about the maturation of an egg, one talks about the ovulation of an egg. So this is quite difficult for students to do, because there's no, we've got to teach them about where the boundaries are with this sort of information, as well as actually getting them to remember all of this information as well. And then if you start to look even closely at not even the subject specific stuff, but stuff then about the response itself, we can see that actually the sentence structures that I'm using in here are actually quite high level. That there's things like consequences being here. If this happens, then this happens. Okay, there's a way of writing about that's not necessarily sort of fluent with our students. I've got the use of things like apositives to add detail to a noun. I've got comparative sentences in here as well. Okay, all of those things are another layer of skill or knowledge that students need in order to write this. And then finally, I've got the use of not necessarily subject specialist language or tier 3 vocabulary, but tier 2 vocabulary, words that are academic, high level, but might have different meanings in different subjects, or students just don't have access to those sorts of words. So we've got examples like secretes and inhibits and maturing and stimulates. These are all words that are not necessarily subject specific, but have a particular meaning within this context of biology as well. So if you look at, those three things I've highlighted there, and then you've got lots and lots of writing on top of that. You've got the movement through the layers of biology as well, so very specific and sort of biochemical layer here, right back out again to this sort of bigger picture of this as well, in terms of the concept like negative feedback as well. So all of that tied together makes this really, really challenging for students to do, and basically my students weren't able to do this. But I was expecting to do that. I was going through my normal lessons. I was teaching them the specification, and then when I assessed them at the end, gave them these sorts of questions. Lo and behold, a minority could do it, but the majority were not being able to do this. Okay, so what were the problems then? Well, the problem is that as an expert, me, the teacher, this is all fluent to me. I know this knowledge inside out. I know these sentence structures. I use them. I don't even think about them. I just use them quite sort of implicitly. And that's because my schema of this is very well developed. And so when I think about the answer to this question, I'm actually just pulling down big chunks of information from the schema, from my schema. Whereas novices like our students then are left juggling all of these different things. They're not fluent enough, their schema are not well developed, and so their working memory, their very limited working memory, is overloaded. And that's going to lead to then at best chaos on the page and at worst a blank page. So what do I need to do then? Well, I need to plan for this novice. Okay, I need to break down the content like I've done a little bit on here already, and I need to carefully sequence how we teach each part within that so that each piece builds on the last piece. So I want to do a little bit about the why before the how here then. So why am I so interested in this and why do I think that the sequencing and the atomizing is the answer? Well, it all comes down to, and I've used the language already, this idea of working memory being limited. So working memory being what you think with. Okay, and it's very easily overloaded. So Sweller's cognitive load theory then proposes that the load on your working memory, your cognitive load, then is acted upon by two different areas. I say two different areas, two different channels, if you like. Okay, we've got the intrinsic load, okay, which is adding to our cognitive load. Now, the intrinsic load is kind of down, is basically down to the difficulty of what you're trying to have your students learn. Okay, now that's obviously very different from one student to the next. Okay, let alone from one bit of knowledge to the next. So it's not just about how hard we think a concept is, it's thinking about how easily students are going to be able to pick up that concept. So it's thinking about the prior knowledge they have before, for instance. And there's also then the extraneous load, which is adding to our cognitive load. Now, the extraneous load then is all to do with our instructional design. Okay, so that's thinking about things like the task we've set them to gain this new knowledge, or it's thinking about things like the routines in your classroom, the layouts, displays, okay, and yeah, as I said before, standardizing and simplifying the design of the task as well. And there's been a huge amount of focus on that, on this extraneous load as something we can act on to help to optimize cognitive load. So we've got to be careful. We don't want to just reduce cognitive load. We want to optimize it. Okay, so that learning can still occur. It's not too easy, and the brain switches attention to something else. Okay, but that it's not overloaded so that nothing is going to be able to pass through that narrow working memory channel. So a lot of focus on extraneous load because they're fairly easy wins to a certain extent, barring the actions and of the learner. It's all about things like adapting our instructional routines in the classroom. The intrinsic load, though, is I think a bit more difficult to consider how we might impact on that. And I think instead, what might be a better model to consider here, certainly from a scientist perspective, is a model used by Frederick Reif. What he said then is that cognitive load, and particularly the intrinsic load, is dependent on two variables: the demand of the task, okay, but also the resources available to the student. All right. Now, I like this, and as a scientist, you can probably see why, because it gives me variables that I can literally manipulate up or down, and it makes it really clear what I want to do. So, task demand being on top of this calculation, if I want this number to be smaller, not zero, but smaller, then I want to reduce that task demand. Okay, and the other way I could help with that overall cognitive load is to increase the available resources. Okay, and that's really where my talk is going to go from now on. I'm going to talk first of all about how I use atomizing and sequencing then. So breaking the content down and making sure I put it together in a clear narrative as a way of reducing task demand. And then I'm going to talk about the available resources I put in place to increase the available resources in place to again help to optimize that cognitive load. So I know what the problem is. I know why it's there. and I know what I want to do to try and fix this. But what does good atomizing and sequencing look like? Okay, and for that, then I went to Engelmann and his direct instruction programs. So I'm just going to share with you a quote, not from Engelmann himself, but from a paper that reviews or overviews his theory of instruction. So just again, pausing the video to read if you need. I'll give a few seconds anyway. Okay, so you can see here that first sentence is the one that made me realize that Engelmann's sort of ideas are one of the best ways of looking at the idea of atomizing and sequencing. So learning can be made more or less difficult for students depending on the order in which skills are taught. So it's embedded in his principles, in his theories. And I kind of had first-hand experience of that as well, because I've been teaching my daughter to read using one of his programs, and I'm just blown away by the intricate detail of the sequencing. How actually you don't become aware of it until later on, until something appears. You're like, oh right, that's why that came first. Um, but also how the different layers sort of influence things. So in this reading program, then you've got obviously the introduction of phonemes, of sounds, but the thought about which sounds come first and separating similar sounds, for instance, that you perhaps wouldn't have thought about. How teaching certain high value words first, even words that aren't necessarily phonetic as well, because they're high value, that they mean that you can access more challenging content later on as well, right up to when to introduce the grammar of sentences, full stops and capital letters and things, or how complex the stories are, or the line, how many lines they have, where the sentences start on each of the lines. Just so many different layers to thinking about where things come. And I wanted to try and emulate that and think about how that might apply then in biology. So here's a kind of visual of what I think my model is then. So I talked about this idea of layers then. So what I'm looking here then is I've got the overall big sort of principles within biology or within a topic. I'm going to split that down into thinking about what the big questions are, like the one I showed you earlier. Think about the sentences that are made up, those questions, those answers are made up of, and then the facts that are going to be required to build those sentences. So I'm going to use a particular topic here just to kind of show this as a concrete example. So I'm going to start by thinking about the principles within this concrete example then. I'm going to use topic 7 here from the Edexcel GCSE biology specification. I'm using a spec because I think it's going to just remove the argument of things like of what should be in there and shouldn't be in there. The specification's there, they have GCSEs at the end. We need to cover this content. So I think it just helps to kind of focus us a little bit here. So here is that specification then for topic 7. Again, you can pause the video if you really want to have a look through. But to be honest, the bit I'm trying to highlight here is just the sheer volume of content. Here's what I talked about: content-heavy subject like biology, and it's a really daunting prospect to think about how or what order you're going to teach this in. How are you going to sequence it? Do you deviate from the exam board? Have they thought through their sequence? Does it fit in with what you've taught before? And how do you juggle all of this? How do you know when you're trying to put these things in order that you're not missing something out later on down the line? I'd really recommend, if you are sort of thinking about how you might go across this and go through this in the first place, Fabio De Salvo's blog on smashing the spec, literally printing this out, chopping up all the points and starting to group them in that way. And it also works really well collaboratively, because you're going to be helping out less experienced and more novice teachers to see the links between concepts, and yourself, finding those links between concepts as well that perhaps you wouldn't have thought of. So anyway, what principles do I pull out of this then? Well, I'm not going to include all of them, but I'm going to include 4 of them that I think that I started to pull out of this. So again, pausing the video to have a read of those. Now it's fine at this stage then that I've got some overlap. You might have noticed 1 and 2 have got the same spec points included in them. And even I've got this sort of nesting. I've got number 4 probably sits inside number 3 as an example of negative feedback and homeostasis. And that's okay, because that helps me to start to formulate ideas about the order that I'm going to teach this in. Okay, so am I going to teach principle 1 before principle 2? Or would I use principle 2 before number 1, for instance? I know the spec numbers suggest principle 1 is the one to go with, but there's a decision to be made there. Could I use the human female menstrual hormones as an introduction to hormones? Is that the right call? And where does number 4 sit within number 3? Do I want to use it as the first example of homeostasis, or do I want to use one of the other points of something like thermoregulation or blood glucose regulation or something like that? So there's conversations that will start to happen because of these principles that you pulled out. So then from this, I then settle on an order. So here we go. So again, pausing the video to have a read. So you can see here that I just removed the spec numbers now, and I've started to kind of briefly describe things, and I've just talked through some of my decisions then. So here you can I see I decided to lead with what was principle number 1 on the previous page, and I've actually moved the menstrual hormones, the hormones controlling the fertility of human females, right to the end. Now, the reason I've done that is because I think that idea of negative feedback is more complicated. There's more hormones interacting in slightly different ways to the hormones adrenaline and thyroxine at the start. So I think negative feedback as a principle needs establishing first. Okay, and you can see here as well that I eventually decided with principle 4 to just include it within principle 3, and actually that I decided to go with blood glucose regulation first, then thermoregulation, and then building onto osmoregulation, water regulation, again because of the complexity, I think, of that example compared to the others. All right, so those are my principles. I'm actually going to focus now everything from this point on principle number 3. Okay, so we're going to look at this idea of hormones controlling the fertility of human females. So the reason I'm doing that is because as I move down my kind of hierarchy here, it's going to get harder and harder for me to talk about everything all at once. So we're kind of focusing on an individual point now. Now, these big questions then. Well, these big questions are the most challenging questions I want my students to answer, just like the one I showed you at the very start there. Okay, they're the ones I want my students to be able to answer, really, really well, include all the high level content that I want them to be able to do. Now, where am I getting those from? Well, part of it is experience, but exam boards are a good source of these. Have a look at the exam papers. Use things like Exam Wizard and Exam Builder from the different exam boards to actually find examples of those questions. But if you come up with something that you think is high value for you because it's going to help support your A-level teaching down the line, or you just think it is something that is important, that is included at this stage, then absolutely do that. Okay, if you can fit it in, then absolutely that's a decision you can make with this. So here's some examples then of these big questions within this single principle that we're now focusing on. So again, pausing the video to have a read. Okay, so there will be other big questions that go with this, but these are the kind of general ones that I think are really important within this idea. How those 4 menstrual hormones interact in terms of preventing further pregnancy. Okay, so once the female is pregnant, how do we prevent multiple pregnancies occurring? And then the application of that in terms of hormonal contraceptives and hormonal fertility therapy as well. And just from me just describing it there, the sequence then I think kind of is fairly self-explanatory. They need the knowledge of those menstrual hormones in order to apply it to contraceptives and to fertility therapy. Okay, so this first one here has to come before here and here. So let's have a look at how that affects the sequence that I started to pull together. So again, pausing the video to have just a quick look. I've bolded what I've added. So now I've just come back to that detail now within principle number 3. And remember I said that I wanted to include the menstrual cycle and hormones first. That knowledge is that key knowledge is required in order for them to apply it to contraception and to fertility treatments, which come next. The order of those isn't hugely important, but again, I think contraception is an easier idea to understand than fertility treatments. I think it builds better in that order there. So this sequence now is beginning to have more detail within each point here. So I'm adding to things within that. But if I felt that going through this actually, maybe I do want to include, I'll put this principle first, then I can do that. And I think that's important to consider that each layer you could be making big changes to the overall sequence if you think it's necessary. So on to my next layer then. Okay, if we think back to that response that I had at the start, and I identified sentence structures within that answer. Okay, so I need to be able to now think about what those sentence structures are, and whether that's going to affect or what order I might teach those in, or if that's going to affect the order of things as well. Okay, so again, I'm going to focus on one particular part. Okay, so I'm going to focus now just on the hormones, the menstrual cycle and the hormones. So within principle 3, that point A here, again, just to following this kind of chain down, just focusing on one box at a time to try and make this nice and precise. Okay, so let's have a look at some examples of sentences that I think students are going to need to get their heads around for this. Okay, so here's one example. Okay, so students are going to need to get their head around sequencing, the chronology of things, that some things happen before others, some hormones act before others. Okay, and that's important that students are able to write in that way and see that structure of that sentence. Here's another one. So students are going to need to chain multiple facts together. Okay, so here we've got hormone FSH, and we've got facts of where it's secreted from, what its target is, okay, and what it does as well. And another. So I mentioned this then in this response I went through, but comparisons are huge in biology. So being able to compare different hormones and what they do and see the similarities and differences, that's another structure of sentence, a different way of writing. Here's another example. So now we've got things, connections between facts as well. So not just necessarily chronology or sequencing of things or comparisons, but actually one thing affecting another. And another form of that might look like this. So where we've got the sort of consequences of certain events or scenarios occurring. All right, using that if this, then that sort of structure to things as well. So a proposed scenario, for instance. So all of those are going to need sort of thinking about in terms of what order I think they best come in, if you like. So let's have a look at how that might affect my sequence now. So from that, I've decided, if we again got the bold additions here, so again pausing the video to have a read. So thinking about all those different sentences, I think it's important that they have a clear understanding of the events of the menstrual cycle in the first place, ovulation, menstruation, and things. They need to know what those things are and in what order they occur. I then need to think about what the hormones do within that, okay, where they come from, what are their target organs and things. And lastly, I need to then think about how they act on each other with this concept of negative feedback. How do the hormones interact and either inhibit or stimulate the secretion of each other? But again, we can't do that third point there before the other two. So just looking at those sentences has helped me to sequence those the knowledge within that third principle there. Okay, so now I'm going to focus then on the roles of the menstrual hormones. So I'm going to focus particularly on 3A, 2 here. Okay, so again, thinking about my moving down this hierarchy, I'm now focusing on one of these bits here, basically. And now we're down to the bottom. We're now looking at the individual facts, these factual atoms that students are going to need to grasp. Okay, these are the facts that those sentences I've just shown you are actually written about in the first place. Okay, so again, let's have a look at some examples of that. So again, pausing the video to have a read. Okay, so what I'm doing at this point then is really the sort of micro level of sequencing. So I'm looking at these different facts about these menstrual hormones, and these ones are particularly tied to estrogen. And I'm thinking, right, is there a order that I need to introduce these in when I'm talking about it? And actually, I don't think there's a huge issue here about fact 1 and 2. I'm not sure it matters necessarily, although from a chronology perspective, you might argue that you want to teach estrogen being secreted, because that's what happens first, and then what its target organ is. But fact number 3 absolutely needs to come after those two there. Okay, what it does. There's no point in talking about what it does if you don't say about what its target organ is in the first place, or what a target organ is in the first place as well. Okay, so um, from this, then I'm just saying, I guess that some facts are going to need to come before others. So let's have a look at how that influences this sequence. So again, pausing the video to just have a look. Again, I've bolded the additions I've made. So you can see here then that I've decided that the glands, then the target organs, then the functions need to be taught, that sequence of things. And actually what I've done is I've split these four menstrual hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and then FSH and LH. And probably if you're watching this as a non-subject specialist, you're probably happy with estrogen and progesterone. You might remember that. Maybe not FSH and LH. Okay, so and I think that relates to the difficulty with which the difficulty that's associated with those. Okay, I think it's easier to understand what estrogen and progesterone do before then understanding what FSH and LH do. You could argue there's a chronology idea here that where you should do it in the order that they act, but I think it's the idea of the pairs of hormones in terms of their difficulty of what they do is more important there. So the sequencing and the atomizing I've done so far has all been about reducing task demand. Okay, so that's why I've done this atomizing and breaking things down right from the big principles to their facts. And then I've also thought carefully about the order and also how each of those layers can influence that order of that content. But there comes a point where the questions we want them to answer require all of that knowledge. Okay, so we can sequence it and we can break it down to help them acquire it as much as we like. But there comes a point where it's still a very large task. The demand of the task is very high, and that's going to influence then and increase that cognitive load potentially to overload. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about what I'm going to do to help to increase the available resources. Now, Rife talks about two types of resources. He talks about external resources. So they're things like knowledge organizers or textbooks, for instance, okay, or things like maybe like even like things like calculators, okay. But all of those things are temporary. Once you take them away, the students can't use them, and that's going to affect then their cognitive load because it's going to reduce the number of available resources. So what I'm interested in are internal resources that Rife talks about. And those really all come down to prior knowledge. Okay. And it comes down to the retrieval of that prior knowledge and how easy that is. In other words, it comes down to fluency and automation. Okay. Now, what I want to do, remember, is I want to allow working memory to focus on the challenge of the material, but it's the interactions of the material, the linking of the facts, how one hormone affects the other, etc. That's the challenge. So what I need then is all of the other stuff as much as possible to be automated, okay, to have at their mental fingertips. All right, so maths have got things like times tables. Well, what are the biology times tables then that I think need to be practiced then to fluency? Now, Engelman talks about this idea as well, and actually I'm going to use the same quote again. So again, pause the video to read if you need to. But this time it's the second sentence I want to focus on. The key principle is that students should be well prepared for each step of the program to maintain a high rate of success. So as well as the sequencing, Engelman's talking about the idea that actually it's the preparedness to move on to the next step that's also just as important. Okay, so I'm going to share another quote here from that same paper of help me distill what I should focus on to automate to increase those available resources. So what Engelman's saying here is there are key ideas that are ones that are going to be generalized as much as possible. These high value ideas that can transfer from sort of beyond the topic within the context within their taught. Okay, so when I'm thinking about these, what would they be in biology? And from my model, I think they come down to these two ideas here: the sentence structures and the factual atoms. Now, the factual atoms are explicit. You need those facts in order to answer questions about those facts. And I think probably that's not a shock to anyone that we need that. But the sentence structures, I think, are more implicit, and things that teachers don't necessarily notice are required and should be fluent as well. We shouldn't be really getting students to have to worry about what type of sentence they need to use. It should just be there, ready to go. Okay. So how do I go about doing that then? Well, I'm going to focus on the facts first of all. I'm going to talk about some ways in which I make sure that those facts get practiced to fluency. So I'm going to show you two questions here, okay, both about estrogen, both actually with the same answer. So here's the first version. Okay, so it looks okay because it's got a nice, clear, single answer, okay, and it shows students' understanding of that idea. But if I show you a second version, so same question effectively, but I've been much more precise with my language. And I'm fostering now connections between facts because I'm using the word gland and I'm going to use the word secretes, and I'm going to use that in different contexts. I'm going to use that for progesterone and FSH and LH and other hormones. Okay, and so students are then going to build up a wider knowledge of what a gland is, what secrete means, which are other questions that I want them, and other facts that I want them to have as well. Okay, so in terms of how I build up the fluency of that then, so I'm going to be using things like low stakes quizzing, comprehension questions within lessons, just verbal questioning and answering. Now for the verbal questioning and answering, I want to increase further that flexibility of this knowledge. And I do that by repeating and overlapping questions. So again, let's have a look at another sequence of questions. So again, pausing the video if you need to have a read. Okay, so all of these are obviously practicing slightly different facts, if you like, but they're all centered around estrogen. They all require knowledge of estrogen, and they are building a schema then of estrogen, where it's secreted from, what its target organ is, what its function, what does it interact with overall. And if I use these questions then, and I kind of overlap the knowledge like that, what I'm doing is I'm building a schema through which students have to retrieve through different pathways to get to that knowledge. I'm increasing the flexibility, promoting the flexibility of that knowledge now, so that it's going to become more automatic. There's more pathways to find stuff about estrogen. It is more likely that students can find that with little thinking. Okay, so they're my factual atoms, how I'm going to get those to fluency. The sentences are slightly different then. Okay, so the sentence structures that I'm going to have to choose here. There's too many to just focus on or to be able to have all of them. I'm also going to think about where I include these and how I'm going to do that. So let me just show you what I do with this. So again, pausing the video to have a read. So let me just talk through this. It's a worked example with a failed example, but it's the beginnings of a task that's going to practice this sentence structure. So I've named it for one. I've given it a name to give it a shared language. So eventually with students, I should be able to talk about if this, then that sentences, okay? Or linking sentences, okay? Or comparisons. So I'm just giving it a quick name so that we can talk about them and students know what that looks like. I've given worked examples to show what exactly it should look like, and in delivering that, I would highlight the structure of the sentence that I'm interested in. Okay, the if and then and what comes after that and where I've pulled that information from. And then I've used a faded example to make sure that students are on board with that they know what the sentence structure should be, but also what knowledge they need to retrieve from there as well. Okay, now in terms of where I build this in, this would come at sort of not every lesson, but every few lessons to kind of group knowledge together. Now, the reason for that, if I then show you my sequence of questions with this, again, pausing the video to have a read of that. So the reason it's not going to be every lesson, one is time, but two is because I'm keeping the sentence structure constant here. And therefore, there's a possibility that students' attention is going to waver because they're going to get automated with that sentence structure. So to keep that interest, if you like, to keep that cognitive load at an optimized level, I need some difficulty in there. I need to actually make the task slightly more demanding. And so I need to choose, the questions need to be from knowledge from various places. So as well as having things like the menstrual hormones in there, LH and the egg and pituitary gland and things, I've got things like thyroid, and I've got things like chromosomes, mitosis question there, and a neurotransmitter question there as well, to really test those students and make sure that the, there is a level of cognitive load that's going to allow learning to actually occur in the first place. And you can see I've got 11 questions there. That's lots and lots and lots of practice, all of the same sentence structure, so that it becomes fluent. And that's the aim of the game with this. In order for those students to have more available resources, this stuff has to be fluent within that. So to summarize then, really, yes, this takes a long time. Okay, it takes a long time to do that for one topic, but I now have model answers for big questions. I've got sentence structures that I know I need to practice. I've got factual knowledge that I can produce questions from for comprehension questions or for low stakes quizzes. Okay, all of that is going to be used by me to then produce a booklet, and that's going to codify this topic. It's going to set out exactly what needs to be taught for this topic, and those topics build together to a curriculum overall then. Okay, so my planning really becomes adapting everything I've just talked you through today to the class in front of me. Okay, but much of the thought of the content is done. It's ready. So yes, it takes a long time, but in the long run, it's going to save time. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about then is just obviously references and reading, and point you in the direction of what I've looked at then. So the first three here talk very much about cognitive load theory. So Sweller being the sort of architect of that. That paper then having an update on it is quite useful to sort of have a look at how he's changed his sort of views on certain things. And the book I referenced then, or the author, sorry, Frederick Reif, and his book on applying cognitive science to education has that really nice model in there as well on those pages that I've listed. And as an accessible kind of version of that, Adam Boxer's got a great blog on simplifying cognitive load theory, looking at Reif's kind of model of things like that. And then I had the other side of things of Engelman and his direct instruction, his theory of instruction. So there's the reference there to his kind of paper book, okay. But that paper as well that I use, that's got a nice overview. And just lastly at the bottom there, I have blogged about this. So if you want to kind of have a reference point as well as this this talk, then do feel free to head over to that blog there as well. So just last thing really is to say just thank you for tuning in. If you've got any questions, please grab me on Twitter or on the blog. Yeah, thank you again to Research Ed Norwich and for organising all of this. All right, take care, everyone.